If you are jumping into boudoir photography, there's a good chance you are starting with natural light. That's what I did when I started my studio 8 years ago, and honestly, I still shoot primarily with natural light. Natural light is great, especially if you're a beginner, because it's free. It's everywhere. You don't have to pay for any new lighting equipment, and you don't have to try to figure out how to shoot with strobes and flash and everything if you are brand spanking new and you're not really sure where to start. Like, you just got your camera and now you know, hey, I want to do boudoir. Cool, let's shoot with natural light because it's available and ready pretty much all of the time. But it can be a little fussy and tricky to work with as well. So if you are jumping into boudoir photography and you don't really know how to work with natural light yet, then I'm glad you're here because I've got some tips for you. These are all things that I had to kind of figure out the hard way. So I'm glad that I can share what I've learned so you don't make the same mistakes that I made, okay? Because I've been there. Before we can even talk about natural light, we'd have to talk about kind of light in general and how it works on our camera. So there's something called an exposure triangle, and this is going to be the way that you light a subject and the way that light enters your camera, really. More so, I guess, the latter. The exposure triangle is a representation of how aperture, ISO, and shutter speed all work together to affect the exposure of an image. They work together, so when you adjust one, you're going to be affecting the other two as well. The exposure triangle is those three elements that I just mentioned. That changes how the light reaches your camera sensor. At the end of the day, that's what controls your brightness and clarity on an image. So I'm going to go through this in the abridged version. Feel free to dig into it more if you really want to get the details. But you've got something called aperture, okay? That's going to be the size of your lens opening. And that affects the amount of light that is allowed into your camera as well as your depth of field. So if you have an f-stop of 16, for example, we have a very long depth of field. If we have an f-stop at like 1.4, you have a teeny tiny narrow little depth of field. But when you're shooting at f16, you need a lot of light. If we're shooting at 1.4, we don't need as much light. Shutter speed is going to be the next little stop on your triangle. That determines how long the shutter stays open. So a very, very quick shutter speed, like 1/200th of a second, compared to like 1/10 of a second, right? That 1/200th, very quick. We're not letting a lot of light in. 1/10 of a second, your shutter is going to stay open for a long time, letting in a lot of light. Which is why, for example, night photography, those shutter speeds are typically really slow so that a lot of light can be let into the camera. The downside to having a slower shutter speed, though, means you might get some shake, and that's going to affect the clarity of your photo. So typically with portraits, the advice I was given was 1/60th of a second. I actually prefer to shoot at 1/200th of a second if I can. But that's going to limit the amount of shake and possible motion blur that you might get when you're trying to photograph your client in your boudoir studio. And then the last element of that exposure triangle would be ISO. And that represents the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. So when we're thinking about ISO, we typically think of grain. The higher your ISO, the more grain or noise you're going to see in your final shot. Cameras are getting better and better these days. A lot of them can thrive at a very high ISO. You just kind of need to know what camera you're working with and see what your camera is capable of handling, because you probably don't want a ton of noise in the portraits that you're taking. They can, just like mess with the clarity of your image a little bit. So remember, hey, if I'm going to change my aperture to let in less light, then I probably need to change either my shutter speed or my ISO to let in more light in order to still keep my exposure properly exposed, properly balanced. So play around with that and know that if I'm changing one element, I need to change the other two as well, which is why shooting in manual mode is probably the way to go when you are working with natural light as a boudoir photographer. I know that the auto mode is going to be tempting, but if you're brave enough to jump into manual, which I highly recommend, you're going to have so much more control over the light and the way that is going to change the mood or the vibe of the portrait that you're taking. So now that we understand our exposure triangle, we can talk about the two types of natural light that you're probably going to be dealing with the most in a boudoir setting, which is going to be direct sunlight or diffused light. Direct sunlight, it can be harsh to shoot in, but that's because you're kind of looking right at the sun, right? It's going to blind you a little bit. Not ideal for portrait photography. Now, in the boudoir world, we have a slight advantage because a lot of our shots are where the clients are looking down or they're looking away. They're kind of looking like they're in their own mind, they're in their own thoughts, and they don't have to connect with the camera. I'm kind of documenting someone being in their own world. So I can have someone point their chin towards the sun and just tell them to look down. If you want them to look with their eyes open, then you could give them a countdown of like 1, 2, 3, open, and take that shot really quick. But keep that in mind when you are working with direct sunlight. It is harsh. It creates a lot of shadow, and it will show every single pore, every single line, every single wrinkle, because it's creating a ton of shadow around any piece of texture. So when we're shooting boudoir, for example, that's not always something that our clients are really looking for. There's nothing wrong with skin texture. We all have it. But it might be distracting to your client. So you'll have to keep that in mind when you're shooting. Is direct sunlight going to be the best option for this client, depending on what we're working on? On the other hand, you've got something like diffused light. And this is where I would say the majority of boudoir photographers like to hang. The direct sunlight is great for maybe more artsy or very, very high contrast shots. But the diffused light, it's so pretty and it's so beautiful and it's always beautiful. And that's what most people like to shoot boudoir with. Picture like an overcast day. That's diffused light. It's very soft. It's very evenly distributed, which is so nice. And you really don't have to worry about any harsh shadows, any harsh lines. It is what I prefer to shoot with in my studio. And actually, when I was building out my space, I hung up blinds that are like a very thick paper to basically create diffused light for me anytime I want. Sheer curtains will also do that for you. So if you're working in an indoor space, it's kind of nice having the sheer curtains or the sheer blinds because I can open them for when I want those very, very harsh direct sun photos. I get the sunspots on my floor, have a client laying there. I get those very, very dark, high contrast shadows that I want for a very moody type of photo. And then I can pull the blinds down and we get very soft, diffused light for the rest of the session. So that would be my recommendation, is stick with the diffused light for maybe the majority of your shots, but don't be afraid to play with that direct sun either. Just be aware of where your shadows are falling and how your subject is illuminated. Now, when we're working with that light, there's kind of 3 directions that we're going to play around with. There's really 3 main options. Your light can be coming from the side. Think high contrast. Think shadows and depth. And light from the side tends to be for darker and moodier type shots. This is what I really like to shoot with. And it's pretty common in boudoir. Your subject is going to be 45 to like 90 degrees angled to your light source. 45 degrees is actually really, really common in portrait work, and it's also known as Rembrandt lighting. Rembrandt lighting is when we get this triangle of light on one side of the face. So this side will be illuminated, and then we'll also have a triangle here with shadows going along the cheekbone. very common in a lot of portrait photography, including boudoir. I really love lighting subjects from the side because it does create more contrast, and when I'm trying to show off curves, I want that contrast. So when light is coming from the side and I'm trying to get maybe a detail shot of someone's chest, I'm going to get highlight, and then I'm going to get shadow where their cleavage would be, and then I'll get more highlight, and then I'll get shadow on the other side. So their curves are just being illuminated in this gorgeous way. Same thing for like booty shots. I love a high contrast booty shot because the top of the booty, the roundest part, is being illuminated, and then the center is in shadow. It's really stunning, and I would recommend playing around with that. But you may not always want all of your light to always be on the side of your subject, which is why you can also photograph the light source directly in front of your subject as well. This type of lighting, typically you'll see it with product photography, you'll see it for fashion shoots, still life, that kind of thing. When your light source is directly in front of your subject, that does tend to be a more flat lighting. It illuminates everything very evenly. There's not a lot of shadow, and sometimes this creates a very balanced and aesthetic look, and sometimes it creates a very bleh, kind of flat look. So to help with this, you can create contrast by having some sort of different background, maybe a darker background or something with texture. That can be really helpful. Yes, hello. You're being loud. You're being very loud. All right, go lay down. Go lay down. I will tend to use flat lighting if I'm doing like portrait work with a background. If my client wanted a more like fashion type shot, fashiony kind of boudoir where I'm having her stand, I've a softbox in front of her, and then the background, that tends to be when I use more of a flat lighting situation. But again, I tend to do that more with like constant light than natural light, although you could do the same with either. And then the last direction of your light can be backlit. This is great for silhouettes, and it's great for sun flares. It kind of creates this glow and like halo effect around your subjects. Very pretty for a more dreamy type boudoir session. It can be a little bit challenging to use though, I'm not gonna lie. It can be tricky to expose your subject, especially if you're only working with natural light behind your subject, which is why, again, silhouettes are so nice because the background then, where your natural light is coming from, can be properly exposed, but your subject then will be very underexposed, looking almost black on your camera, which is why, again, it's great for silhouettes in studios. Outside, if you're shooting outdoor boudoir, maybe during golden hour or blue hour, very, very pretty as well, because that's when you get those sun flares and that really dreamy, ethereal glow. Oh, it's just delicious light. And I would recommend trying out blue hour, which is right before the sun rises or right after the sun has set. And golden hour is about the hour before the sun sets or the hour after the sun has risen. When we're shooting with natural light, we got to remember that we can't move our light source. We have to be the ones who move, or our subject has to be the one who moves. So think about where you want those curves, those shadows, and those highlights. When we're shooting boudoir, I like to think about where I want to paint my subject with light, basically. What features of her body, what features of their body do they want to show off? Okay, that should be what's illuminated. If someone's tattoo is really, really important to them, then you better believe I'm going to get some photos where that tattoo is facing towards the light. If someone, for example, wants to work on loving the stretch marks that are on their tummy after they gave birth to their child, then I might bust out some direct light. And I might really want that texture to shine because I want them to see that texture in a totally different, unique way. So these are things you got to keep in mind. How do you want to light your subject, and where do you want that light to come from? Do you want it from the side for more contrast? Do you want it from the front for more of a fashion type photo? Do you want them backlit and glowing, or maybe really dark as a silhouette? These are all things you get to play around with when you're shooting with natural light and you're doing boudoir. My little bonus tip for you, I like to use my hand to see where the light is coming from. So I'll put my hand out and I'll try to figure it out. You can see here, if I do it with you, it's out of focus, but that's okay. When I turn my hand towards my light source, look at how beautifully that's all illuminated. That's pretty flat lighting. If I do this, you can see where the shadow's being created by my palm. Okay, that's something I got to keep in mind. And when I start to move away from my light, now all the good stuff, you can't even really see it because it's in the shadow. So play around, stick your hand out, move it around, and figure out where your light is coming from. You don't look crazy, I promise. If you hear any little tippy tappies, that's my dog. He came to the studio today, so you may hear him click-clacking in the background. But let's get back to where our lighting source is. So if you're shooting outside and your sun is above you, your brows actually stick out from your skull a little bit and will cast a shadow across your face. And this is like, it almost gives you like a black eye effect, or like raccoon eyes. And that's not really great. The eyes are really, really important in any kind of portrait photography, including boudoir. So we want to make sure that we can see the eyes. Even better if we can get a catch light in the eyes, which is when we can see light reflecting in the eyes, which is why nose towards the sun is a really, really helpful tip. That's how you get those catch lights. If your natural light is from below and is coming up towards you, then you get monster lighting. Also not something we probably want for boudoir. Your cheeks also stick out, and those will also cast a shadow on your eyes. That's when you tend to see a really dark shadow right here. So think of like old monster movies. Those are typically illuminated from below. And that's the effect that you're going to get when you're photographing your boudoir clients. And that's not typically the vibe that we want. If you can find a spot with nice soft light somewhere in the shadows, maybe there's a tree or a building that's casting a shadow, shoot there. And also look for dark or textured backdrops just to create more contrast between your subject and what's going on behind them. If you are photographing the sky with just natural light, this can be pretty tricky. Because in order to expose both your subject and the sky properly, you are going to need an additional light source. You would probably need a flash or some type of very, very bright constant light. But again, we don't have those things yet. We're just working with natural light. So I have a little trick. We're not going to get it correct in camera, and instead what I would recommend doing, if having the sky in the photo is very important to you, then I would expose the sky properly. And then my subject is going to be underexposed, right? Because the brightest part of the photo will be the sky. That's where the light is coming from, meaning my subject is going to be very dark. And then I open up that photo in Camera Raw. You can do this in Lightroom. I use Bridge. I'll create a mask on my very underexposed subject, and I'll just adjust the exposure and the brightness and the contrast in post. So that it is one way to work around that. If you really don't have another light source, it does get the job done. Now, if I'm shooting, for example, at golden hour, then I'm okay with my sky looking kind of white. I don't really care. Then I expose for my subject, if again, I don't have any other kind of light source available. Something else to keep in mind when we're working with natural light is the color temperature of that light. So you're going to want to check the Kelvin on your camera when you're shooting with your natural light, because natural light changes. Even now as I'm talking to you, I can see the sun coming in and out. And despite having a constant light on, I have so many windows in my studio to one side that you can still see the sun changing. And when it goes behind a cloud, I look a little bit cooler. When the sun comes out, I look a little bit warmer. That's something you need to think about when you're shooting your clients. The sun sun's temperature tends to fall between like 5,000 Kelvin and 6,500 Kelvin. Cloud cover, though, like I just mentioned, can make light look a little bit cooler, and the time of day can actually affect the temperature of your light as well. So, for example, at sunrise and sunset, golden hour, you hear the word gold. What does that tell us? Well, it means that our light is probably very, very, very warm. It's really yellow, it's really orange. But around noon, the light is a lot cooler. So you might be shooting at like 2,000 Kelvin. The light might be like 2,000 Kelvin at sunrise, but then like 5,500 at noon. So you're going to have to change that on your camera when you're shooting, depending on how warm or cool you want your subject to be. You got to find the happy medium, right? Do you like to shoot really, really, really warm? Do you like to shoot really cool? Somewhere in the middle. I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. I'm normally around 5,800. So whatever your artistic voice says to you, go with that. But keep in mind, you're going to need to change that if you want that same color cast. Like, you're going to need to change that setting on your camera depending on how the sun is changing throughout the day. And speaking of color, we have to think about color cast as well, which is something that natural light can screw with you. Like if you're in an area, for example, with a lot of green grass, maybe you're doing a ton of outdoor boudoir work, I don't know. But if you're outside and there's a lot of grass, that grass is actually going to create a green color cast. Not ideal. In my studio, I have red satin sheets on my bed, and sometimes those red satin sheets, if there's a lot of light hitting it, will create a bit of a red cast in the shadows of my subject. Which is why I think you notice in a lot of boudoir studios, they're working with white walls, black walls, or some kind of neutral like brick color. Not red brick, like brown brick or something like that. My studio, for example, I have a white wall all along where my windows are. My studio is actually green, but where my window light is, I painted that wall white because I didn't want any cast coming from the direction of my windows. I thought, if I paint around the windows some color, that is going to cast on my subject, and I do not want that. Whereas the other half of my studio, away from the windows, that's green, beautiful too, because my subjects will stand out from it. And I don't really shoot very close to these walls, so I don't have to worry about too much of a cast being created because my subjects don't get very close to those walls on that side. Wardrobe can also affect this if you're shooting just regular portrait work. We don't have to deal with it too much in terms of like being a boudoir photographer because our subjects are not normally wearing a lot of clothing. If you had someone show up for like a fashion shoot and they're in an orange dress, there's a chance that that orange is going to cast and create orange in the shadows underneath their jaw. Not something we have to think about too much as boudoir photographers, but it is something to keep in mind. Maybe they're wearing a robe or something like that. We just want to watch for that. Also, the clothing that you're wearing can create a cast on your subject. So typically when I shoot, I'm in relatively neutral clothing or nothing too bright. I'm never going to show up for a session wearing like a neon pink outfit because that neon pink will reflect onto my subject, and I just don't want to deal with trying to fix that in post. It's not always something we can avoid, so you may need to create a brush in Bridge or Lightroom to change those hues in the shadows or whatever. I've done that with the red silk sheets, like I said, if someone's sitting on them and I have to just take out a little bit of red in the shadows, I'll do that, but it's not too much of an issue normally for me. So again, that's something that's really important to watch for. Now, when it comes to tools, you may need some. Even though we're not working with any kind of artificial light, there are still some tools that you might want to have on hand so that you can use natural light to the very best of your abilities. And the first is a light diffuser, especially if you're working outside. We talked about diffused light, right? Here in my studio, my blinds are my diffuser, or you might have sheer curtains. Those are your diffuser. If you're shooting outside, you can buy something that's basically in the same shape as a reflector, and it will diffuse the light for you. So even if you're working in the middle of a field and there's no way to get any soft shadows from a tree or something like that, and the sun is right above you, if you have an assistant with you, they can hold the diffuser and create all of that soft, dreamy light that we want so badly. You may also need a reflector. These are especially important for outside sessions, although I've used them inside just a few times. Typically, I only bust out my reflector though when I'm shooting outside. Extra important if you plan on shooting a backlit subject, but you still want them illuminated, because think about it. The sun is over there, my subject's in the middle, and then I'm here. So the sun is actually pointed towards me. If I held a reflector up, that light comes towards me, bounces off the reflector, and goes back to my subject and illuminates them. So they get to be bright and properly exposed as well. Reflectors are very, very, very helpful. And I would recommend getting one if you're going to be shooting any kind of work outside. Now, inside, you can use a reflector as well, but it's going to look maybe a little bit different than the round one that you take outside. And that would be with a V-flat. A V-flat is a reflector basically that has black on one side, white on the other, and they stand up. V-flat is the name brand, but you can get other versions. I've made my own actually. It's the one that I have is a piece of cardboard mounted together with Velcro clips, and then one side is black, one side is white. If I have the white close to my subject, so my light's coming in, it's hitting the white, it's bouncing back towards my subject, the shadows will soften. If I have the black up, the light will hit and kind of stay with the black, and my shadows actually get a little bit darker, and I can create more contrast. So in a studio setting, a V-flat or some kind of black or white reflector helps you control the shadows a lot. So you may want to add that to your studio. And if you are planning on shooting a lot of stuff outside, then I would recommend an ND filter and or some kind of polarizer filter, just because these can really help control light, reduce glare, and they even can boost your color saturation. So you may want to look into shooting with those. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this, natural light is not something you can really control. It's gonna do whatever it's gonna do, even seen by this video as the sun came in and out a lot, right? Eventually, you may want to invest in some sort of constant light or flash. I recently invested in 2 brand new tube lights that I absolutely love, and you can watch that right after this video. I'll make sure you're able to check those out. I'll leave the link in the description. But when you're getting started, you're brand new to Boudoir, then natural light is awesome. It's going to be your best friend. I love to shoot with it. I feel like it looks the most natural and authentic when shooting Boudoir. I like my sessions to look like someone is just hanging out in their bedroom and I'm a little fly on the wall who happens to be there, and I'm documenting them at the same time. And since the majority of people don't have flashes or any kind of, softbox or beauty dish at their house, it would make sense that we would shoot with natural light. Eventually, you can get to the point where your artificial light actually looks like natural light, and then you can really, really control how your subject is illuminated. But if you are just starting out, I'm letting you know you can totally start your boudoir studio just with natural light. It's a great jumping off point. I've been doing this for 8 years, and it is still the light that I probably use the most. Eventually, you can start integrating other lights into your setups, and you'll have a blast doing all of that. But don't feel like you have to jump into that right now, especially if you're just getting started. What's most important is that you understand where light is coming from, how that light affects the mood, and how you can control that light in your camera with your settings, with your exposure triangle, with your color temperature. All of that is what's going to make you an even better boudoir photographer, not the amount of gear that you have when you're just starting out. So play with light, grab a friend, move around, see how it photographs, and focus on really understanding how to control that light, and I promise your photos are going to get so much better. Thank you for joining me. I hope you learned a few things, and get out there. Happy shooting. Oh, and if you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.